They thought steel was sacred, that nothing forged by men could melt it. But somewhere in the freezing forests of Europe, in the last winter of the war, that belief burned away. Literally. It started with a sound no one heard. No explosion, no roar, just a whisper. Then, a flash so brief it could have been a trick of the eyes. And when the light faded, something was wrong. The side armor of a German Panther 40 millimeters thick, hardened to withstand everything the Allies could throw at it, had opened like wax under a lightning strike. Inside, the air was no longer air. It was fire. Metal glowed orange, then white. Everything, oxygen, fabric, flesh, fused into one blinding instant of heat. 3 seconds. That was all it took for a machine of steel and pride to become a coffin of smoke and silence. The few who crawled out didn't speak of ballistics or armor. They whispered one word: Hexenfeuer, Witchfire. The rumors spread like frost. Tank crews swore they'd seen American shells that left perfect circles through armor, edges smooth as glass. Others claimed the rounds set fire inside the tank without touching fuel or ammo. There was no sound of impact, just the hiss of hell itself. German officers called it superstition, but even they avoided talking about it at night, because no one could explain how a small Sherman tank, the one they used to mock, was suddenly killing tigers and panthers with single shots. To the Allied soldiers, it was a secret weapon. To the Germans, it was witchcraft. And to history, it became something even stranger. A moment when science crossed a line, and fear became measurable in degrees Celsius. What they didn't know was this: the weapon wasn't born in a battlefield, but in a laboratory, in the quiet hum of American engineers who believed physics could do what courage alone could not. This is the story of the witch round, a piece of tungsten and terror that melted through German steel and into the mythology of war itself. The year was 1944. Across Europe, war had become an equation: steel versus steel, armor versus speed, science versus desperation. For American tank crews, it was a losing game. Their Shermans, mass-produced, dependable, but painfully outmatched, were meeting Panthers and Tigers head-on. And every encounter felt the same. The German guns fired first and last. American shells bounced harmlessly off sloped armor, like pebbles against a cathedral wall. Crews began calling their own tanks death traps in reverse, because stepping inside one felt less like fighting and more like waiting. At headquarters, reports piled up. 5 Shermans for 1 Panther. Standard ammunition, ineffective at all practical ranges. Morale was collapsing faster than the front lines. Something had to change. But the answer didn't come from generals. It came from men in white coats in a place far from Europe, where war was fought with pencils, not rifles. Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. A field of mud and mathematics. Here, the U.S. Office of Scientific Research and Development had been running experiments few outside the lab could even understand. They weren't building a bigger gun, they were building a smarter bullet. One engineer wrote, "We can't match their armor. We can only surpass their physics." The idea was radical. If speed alone couldn't pierce armor, maybe density could. So they turned to a strange, stubborn element called tungsten, heavier than lead, harder than steel, able to withstand heat that would melt almost anything else on Earth. They forged it into a small, needle-like core, dense, sharp, and nearly indestructible. Then they wrapped it in a lightweight aluminum shell called a sabot, which would fall away after firing. That made the projectile smaller, lighter, and far, far faster. When the first tests fired, the numbers didn't make sense. The tungsten dart was moving at over 3,400 feet per second faster than any armor-piercing shell in existence. At that velocity, even a fraction of an inch meant the difference between survival and vaporization. Engineers watched as their prototype punched clean through test plates, leaving circular wounds with edges melted smooth. It didn't shatter the steel, it drilled through it. Like a ghost passing through walls. The weapon was designated M93 HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing. To the scientists, it was metallurgy turned miracle. To the soldiers waiting in Europe, it was just hope packed inside a brass casing. But there was a catch. Tungsten was rare, expensive, and desperately needed elsewhere. Every round cost more than a soldier's monthly pay. Each bullet became a moral decision who deserved to have it and when to use it. Still, command approved limited production. A few thousand rounds were loaded onto ships, bound for France, hidden in unmarked crates, marked only with one chilling instruction: use sparingly. No one in the field knew what was coming. Not the gunners, not the tank commanders, not even the men who'd be pulling the trigger. They didn't know they were about to fire something that would make the enemy question reality itself. They called it the hot shot. History would call it something else. The witch round. And its baptism was about to begin. The crates had barely reached the front when the first reports began to whisper back through the snow. A Panther destroyed with one shot. No explosion. No warning. Just smoke, screams, and silence. It happened near the French border in late October 1944. A platoon of German tanks held a river crossing against an American column. The crews were veterans. They had faced Shermans before and laughed at them. The plan was routine: wait for the Americans to close, let their shells bounce, then burn them alive. But this time, something else happened. The lead Sherman fired once from 800 yards. The Panther simply stopped. No fireball, no turret flying sky high. Just stillness. Then, thin black smoke began curling from the hatches. Seconds later, nothing moved. When engineers examined the wreck, they found something impossible. A round hole in the armor, edges fused, smooth as glass, the inside charred to white. The crew hadn't even burned, they'd evaporated. German intelligence officers refused to believe it. They blamed faulty ammo, sabotage, or luck. But soon, there were more reports. Panthers hit once and silenced forever. Tigers abandoned, their commanders gone mad. And always the same phrase in every logbook: no explosion detected. Rumors spread faster than orders. Tankers began whispering of a new American weapon, a shell that burned through metal and men alike. They called it Hexenfeuer Witchfire. To them, it wasn't technology. It was a curse. One survivor described it to interrogators later. It didn't hit. It passed through. Like the armor wasn't even there. Another claimed the Americans had found a way to harness lightning. Some swore it was chemical. Others, that it was a forbidden flame from Tesla's lost experiments. The fear became folklore overnight. Inside the Wehrmacht's intelligence branch, scientists scrambled for explanations. Reports of mysterious holes and crew combustion crossed their desks daily. They tried to calculate what kind of heat could do such damage. But the math only deepened the fear. At those temperatures, the air itself could ignite. The pressure spike would crush lungs before the flame even touched skin. That wasn't supposed to be possible. Commanders began warning crews never to show their sides, to move constantly, to fight only in pairs. But physics doesn't care about orders. In the forests of Lorraine and the hills of Ardennes, German tankers started painting extra plates onto their hulls, anything to slow the unseen threat. It didn't help. Each shot carved the same perfect wound. The frontline soldiers didn't understand tungsten or velocity. They only saw something that mocked their faith in steel. They had believed armor was safety, and now armor itself was killing them. The morale that once carried the panzer divisions across Europe began to rot from the inside. A new kind of terror took its place. Not fear of the enemy they could see, but of the one they couldn't understand. By winter, even officers began whispering what soldiers already believed, that the Americans had found a weapon beyond reason, a weapon that made physics itself the enemy. What the Germans called witchcraft was, in truth, something far colder. Physics stripped of mercy. The secret was not magic, but tungsten, a metal so dense it sinks in molten steel, so stubborn it refuses to melt until over 3,000 degrees Celsius. The Americans had taken this element, forged it into a dart no thicker than a man's finger, and fired it faster than sound itself. 3,400 feet per second. That kind of speed doesn't just hit, it transforms matter. When the tungsten core struck armor, its tip didn't deform or shatter. Instead, the steel around it lost coherence. molecules vibrating so violently that the armor melted out of the way. A flash, a hiss, and the shell passed through solid metal, as if it were cloth caught in a storm of lightning. For a few milliseconds, temperatures inside the impact zone soared past 1,200 degrees Celsius. The steel liquefied, vaporized, and a wave of superheated gas rushed into the tank's interior, turning oxygen into fire and air pressure into a hammer blow. Inside, human lungs collapsed before flames touched them. The air itself became a weapon. No explosion, no shrapnel, just heat, speed, and inevitability. That was the true horror. Not what could be seen, but what could be measured. Engineers later compared the tungsten core to a needle of lightning, a projectile that killed not by chemical energy, but by momentum alone. Every fraction of an inch it traveled was energy transferred, kinetic force converted to thermal death. In the ruins of captured tanks, investigators found the same pattern every time: a circular hole, smooth edges glazed with melted steel, and inside, air turned to ash. German scientists eventually identified it: a subcaliber armor-piercing round, the kind they had dreamed of but never built. They had the theory. They lacked the tungsten. Their empire had lost its access to Portuguese and Spanish mines months earlier. The resource that once flowed into German factories was now feeding the Allied war machine instead. In the end, the difference between superstition and science was measured in kilograms of metal. Each HVAP shell, high-velocity armor-piercing, carried a tungsten heart wrapped in an aluminum shell. When fired, that outer casing, the sabot, peeled away mid-flight, leaving only the dart to fly free, silent, unstoppable. Tank crews who fired it said the gun felt different: a sharper recoil, a scream instead of a bang. And when they looked through their sights, they saw something no soldier ever forgets: a fortress of German steel folding open like paper. Witchcraft? No, just a small piece of metal, obeying the oldest law in the universe. That speed multiplied by density creates power. The battlefield had turned into a physics experiment, and the results were horrifyingly efficient. By December 1944, Europe was frozen in blood and silence. Hitler was preparing his last gamble: Operation Wacht am Rhein, what the world would remember as the Battle of the Bulge. Over 200,000 German soldiers and hundreds of tanks descended into the fog-drenched forests of the Ardennes. Their goal was simple and suicidal: split the Allied lines, seize Antwerp, and force the West to negotiate before the Reich collapsed. They moved through the mist like iron ghosts. Panthers, tigers, king tigers, the most feared machines of the war, with armor so thick that American gunners often didn't even bother to shoot. But this time, the Shermans waiting in those woods had something new hidden in their racks: 60 rounds of HVAP, each one gleaming with tungsten and quiet promise. At dawn on December 16th, the forest erupted. The Germans struck with overwhelming force, blasting through the thin American lines, leaving burning trucks and shattered men in their wake. To most, it looked like history repeating itself, the unstoppable tide of German armor. But among the chaos stood a cluster of Sherman tanks, belonging to a worn-down battalion from the 4th Armored Division. They had 11 operational tanks. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, gave a single order: no firing at infantry, only tanks. Every shot must count. At Doxon yards, they saw the black crosses of the approaching Panthers. The air was still. Then one word: fire. The first HVAP round screamed through the snow and slammed into the lead Panther's frontal plate, the very armor that no Allied shell had ever pierced. It didn't bounce. It drilled straight through. The tank rolled another 10 feet, then erupted as the ammunition inside cooked off, the turret launching skyward like a crown torn from a corpse. The second shot tore through another Panther's turret ring. The third sliced clean through the engine compartment of a third. 7 German tanks lay burning in the snow after just 11 shots. Physics had done what courage could not. The survivors of the Panzer unit fled, some abandoning their tanks, others firing blindly into the fog, as if trying to kill the invisible force itself. One German tanker later confessed, "It wasn't war anymore, it was punishment." Across the front, similar scenes unfolded. In the towns of Bastogne, Metz, and Houffalize, German assaults crumbled under the impossible efficiency of the new shells. American crews began to trust the impossible. Aim, fire once, and watch monsters die. Reports flooded headquarters. Enemy tank destroyed by single HVAP impact. No secondary explosion required. Psychological effect extreme. The legend spread faster than the ammunition itself. Crews started calling the HVAP the miracle round. They saved them for the worst moments, marking each one with chalk, sometimes writing prayers or names on the casings. One tanker scrawled, "For every friend you burned." But for the Germans, the miracle was a nightmare. Intelligence units tried to decode the mystery weapon. Was it chemical? Was it radioactive? Some even believed the Americans had discovered a way to fire lightning itself. Captured reports tell a different story. Panic. Experienced Panzer commanders refusing to advance. Crews welding extra armor to their sides, hoping to slow the phantom projectile. It didn't help. The tungsten darts ignored their effort. Veterans who had survived Stalingrad, who had fought in Kursk, who had stared down Soviet T-34 seconds without fear, now refused to enter battle. A few shot themselves rather than lead their men into another engagement. The SS threatened to execute deserters, but fear had already done what bullets could not. Morale disintegrated. Captured soldiers described it best. Shells you can defend against? This isn't a shell. It's something else. It passes through steel like steel isn't real. By January, the German armored core was breaking apart. Every new encounter chipped away at the myth of invincibility that had once defined the Tiger and Panther. The witch round had become more than a weapon. It was psychological warfare, a ghost haunting every battlefield. When a Panther burned, others stopped moving. When a Tiger was hit, its entire column froze. The unstoppable had finally met something that didn't need to stop it, because it simply went through. By the time Allied forces crossed into Germany, one truth had become clear. The reign of armor was ending. Steel could no longer guarantee survival. What mattered now was the science hidden inside a single bullet. The German war machine had been defeated, not by numbers, not by strategy, but by an idea, a belief that even in war, understanding the laws of the universe could be deadlier than fear itself. Spring came slowly to a ruined Europe. When the snow melted, the battlefields revealed their secrets. Rows of burnt tanks, twisted armor, and the quiet evidence of a war that had outgrown its own humanity. Among the wrecks, Allied engineers began collecting what was left. They studied the holes, the burns, the pressure patterns, trying to understand how something so small had changed everything so fast. The results were staggering. The HVAP rounds had accounted for less than 5% of all ammunition fired by American tanks. Yet they were responsible for more than 30% of confirmed heavy armor kills in the final 6 months of the war. Each tungsten core, when used correctly, was worth 20 conventional shells. Efficiency so brutal it bordered on the surgical. But there was another kind of aftermath. One no engineer could measure. German survivors spoke of the silent shot, the flash with no sound, the heat that came from nowhere. Men who had faced Soviet artillery without flinching now dreamed of the burning hole that opened in steel and swallowed everyone inside. Many refused to speak at all. Their silence became its own testimony. American tankers, too, carried their ghosts. They were proud, yes. The witch round had finally leveled the field. But some admitted feeling guilt. They had watched enemy crews bail out, hands up, faces blackened, shaking not from pain, but from disbelief. One commander said, "It wasn't victory. It was physics deciding who lived." When the war ended in May 1945, the laboratories took over where the battlefields had stopped. Scientists studied the HVAP, then built upon it. Longer darts, heavier cores, better sabots. By the 1,950 seconds, a new generation of projectiles emerged. APDS, APFSDs, and eventually, depleted uranium penetrators, all descendants of the tungsten dart that once haunted the Ardennes. The principle remained the same. Speed and density, nothing more, nothing less. But the lesson ran deeper than metallurgy. War had crossed a threshold. It was no longer about who had the thickest armor, but who understood the invisible laws that governed impact, heat, and energy. It was no longer about bravery, but about knowledge. The Germans were right about one thing. It wasn't a shell. It was the future, the moment when matter itself became a weapon. Today, every modern anti-tank system, from sabot rounds to guided missiles, owes its lineage to that small experimental round, rushed into service during the dying months of World War II. The men who fired it called it the hot shot. The men who faced it called it witchcraft. History calls it evolution. The day when human fear met human invention and realized they were the same thing. In the end, a U.S. ordnance officer wrote in 1946, "It wasn't witchcraft that melted German steel. It was tungsten traveling at the speed of inevitability."